figuring out how to get interest is not easy, but that's one part of the equation. Figuring out how to keep people around is another part.
And welcome everyone to Slator Pod. Today on the podcast, we welcome Paul Ghio. Paul's the co-founder of AI video localization startup Supernative. So we're bringing in another exciting startup to the podcast. Hi, Paul, and thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Where are you recording this from today? What country, what city?
I'm in the United States. I'm in Denver, Colorado. So middle of the United States, if people don't know it, known for mountains. I'm at a pretty high altitude, up at 7,400 feet.
Great place for running and all kinds of other outdoor sports, of course.
That's right.
So before we get into Supernative and your and the startup, so just tell us a bit more about your professional background and then your experience in the product space, and how did you then actually come to start a company in the language AI space? I mean, of all the different areas out there, why did you choose this one? But maybe just first a little bit of background. I think you were with Shutterstock and a few other companies before.
Yeah. So it's an interesting story. I mean, I've been in tech for over a decade. Initially got into what is known as growth product, which is basically product roles that are really focused on trying to help accelerate the growth of a company. So from there, ended up overseeing kind of design, research, analytics, and then eventually kind of all of product, if you will, and have worked at a number of different companies. I've worked at very small startups, pre-product market fit, post-product market fit, but in the growth stage. And then I've worked at companies like Yelp, which is well known in the US, and then Shutterstock, which has a little bit of a global presence. So have done kind of the gamut in terms of different types of product work, and then different sizes of companies. One of the things that's been a through line across a lot of my experience is that I've focused on kind of helping creators, or in some instances, craftsmen, kind of do what they do best. And so Creative Market, as just one example, was a marketplace really focused on digital creators, mostly in like the graphic design space, or I'll just call like the 2D design space, and some video content, some audio content, but mostly visuals. And then Shutterstock, kind of same thread where the focus was on both video creators as well as kind of more traditional graphic designers and UI UX designers. So have over 7 years of just helping creators kind of bring work to life and find some level of success. And because I've worked at marketplaces, there's always been two components to that. It's helping people kind of take their projects from a blank canvas, or take their projects from a point of maybe 50% completion, if you will, all the way across the finish line to a point where they deliver something really valuable and impactful. And then I've helped people on the other side of the marketplace, people actually kind of make a living doing what they love. And so given all of that experience, I knew I wanted to start something kind of in the creator space. I'm really passionate about helping creators. I like being around creators. And so that was like one tie-in. And then the thing that I'll add to that is that at Shutterstock, I oversaw a team of about 16 PMs. And one of the groups that rolled up underneath me was internationalization and localization. So Shutterstock at the time was getting 80 million visitors per month, was operating across 24 different languages, a ton of different currencies. We ended up launching 4 or 5 net new languages. And so I got experience operating at a global scale and understanding all of the pain that's required to try to actually go to market and launch something successful, in these different countries and to different audiences, and could definitely go deep there. But that was like some of the origin, kind of the creator experience, getting firsthand experience to internationalization, and localization. And then, of course, AI became kind of the topic at hand, and started both within Shutterstock, and then after Shutterstock started kind of playing around with a few ideas. And this was the one that was just really captivating and interesting and kind of held my attention. So kept going with it.
Just very briefly on Shutterstock and creators. I mean, we're big Shutterstock client. We have a pretty, expensive subscription annually because it's just it's
Yeah,
great.
it can rack
It's
up.
great visual content. So, and we're actually, I guess I'm a consumer of the localized version of it because we're getting invoiced in, I think, from Germany and with all the right, in a German native fashion. But like, are creators a big component of Shutterstock client base, or is it more kind of the enterprise, the bigger ones?
Yeah, so surprisingly, a lot of it is creators. So freelancers, individual designers, designers on small teams. That said, Shutterstock is a really complicated business under the hood, at least relative to what a lot of people think. Because a lot of people think Shutterstock and they go, oh, that's the stock photo place. It's been around for a while. There's lots of different types of content these days. But then above and beyond that, Shutterstock has gotten into the AI space, as you might imagine, and they're actually selling their catalog to large companies like NVIDIA, Meta, Amazon, Google as training data to help all of these model creators, the foundational model creators, kind of create content. So there's that. There's actually a content production arm that acts as an agency and creates commercials for really large companies like Ford Motor Company, has created documentaries. So there's really a collection of at least half a dozen different businesses.
Got it. And so, all right. So you got in a sense, the internationalization, localization component that you oversaw as part of your team. You got the creator, and now you put it together, and you get Supernative.
Yeah, that's the thought. Yeah, it's at the middle of the Venn diagram.
It's the middle of the Venn diagram. So give us the elevator pitch, the maybe extended elevator pitch about Supernative.
Yeah. So, it's changed over time as the industry has changed. But initially, the thought was, going back to some of my experience, a lot of the work that I had done was to try to democratize various kind of things, if you will. So like Creative Market and Shutterstock are two examples. We helped a lot of non-designers create professional design work, especially at Creative Market. And so I think there's a lot of power in that. And the key question that I was asking kind of at the time, about a year ago when I started Supernative, was, is there an opportunity to lower the barriers of entry to localizing content with AI? And I think that opportunity and that same question, of course, is permanent and relevant across a lot of different industries. And from there, I started talking to just a very large and wide spectrum of different types of creators. So I talked to people internally at Netflix in leadership positions. I talked to friends. I have a good friend who's an indie filmmaker, and his last film was just distributed in 10 different languages just to better understand what is the process, the cost, the time, the know-how that's required. Talk to digital course creators, YouTubers, podcasters. And there was kind of two things that became clear. One was the existing ways to get content dubbed were very expensive, very time consuming, and just took a lot of know-how. And because of all of those components, but especially the last component, there was this other audience who had reached a scale where starting to try to reach new audiences was kind of starting to kind of trickle into their brain, maybe even top of mind, but they didn't necessarily know where to start or didn't necessarily have the budget. And so it became clear, okay, there's an opportunity to either take the existing process and use AI to at least augment it, and in some cases, maybe fully replace it. And that's a whole larger conversation. And then in other cases, there was a question of, can we just expand the number of people who have access to this and just kind of bring more people into the fold? So that was, the very high level origin story. But kind of the elevator pitch for us at this point in time is, I'm working with a world-leading ML generative speech researcher. So, relatively niche and focused. This is a published kind of person who has led products at places like Google and has helped build some of these products that are used by tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. And we believe we've built kind of a really compelling technology stack. And of course, we're using some stuff off the shelf. We're using stuff from OpenAI like Whisper and ChatGPT, and of course 11 Labs, which is the gold standard and what everybody typically uses in this space. And then there's a lot of other kind of models that we're using or have even kind of built ourselves to try to deliver the highest quality output that technology will allow at this point in time. And that is paired with the fact that we're trying to compete on cost. We think because we're a small team, we're intentionally kind of bootstrapping ourselves. We explored some different options and decided, you know what, we can kind of offer the same service for 50% less than some of the other folks kind of out there in the space.
I want to go back to the pricing question, the cost question in AI as well. But first, now that you're in this kind of early stage in an incredibly competitive, but also incredibly noisy market that's moving so quickly, what do you think about these kind of viral campaigns that some companies, I guess, intentionally started and actually succeeded? For example, like HeyGen and you know, even 11 Labs got so much traction. Great product, of course. You just said it was the gold standard, but they got so much kind of free coverage, free reception on, you know, social media, but also kind of mainstream media. Like, is that something you want to even try? Is that something you think that you want to do? Does it make sense to try, or like you want to just go more kind of word of mouth and just having a fantastic product that speaks for itself?
Yeah, so it's a great question. You know, going back to last August, I remember we were building the proof of concept for Supernative, just trying to figure out, can we string together all the tech necessary to get to an output that was acceptable and hopefully really exciting for some of the creators. And I think it was HeyGen that had released a video at that time, and Elon Musk commented on it. And of course, like, if Elon Musk is commenting on X, formerly Twitter, then it's just going to get crazy distribution. And that was kind of this weird aha moment of, okay, this tech, people are interested in this tech. They might not necessarily be users, but there's, you know, kind of this exciting novelty factor that I think has accompanied a lot of AI tech. And so that was kind of the genesis, at least from what I saw. And then you saw companies kind of doubling down on that. And you mentioned like 11 Labs and others have found a lot of success. We are going to experiment with some of that stuff. My personal opinion is that the novelty has kind of burned off at this point. And so you have to do something kind of above and beyond just showing somebody, you know, speaking 5 different languages over the course of 30 seconds. And I have a friend, as an example, who he's getting about 100 million visitors, or impressions, I should say, per month across Instagram and TikTok. And he's basically taking this technology, but then kind of rewriting the script. So you have, as an example, a politician, an athlete, kind of saying something that's like funny and relevant and kind of contextual to kind of the moment in time, to what might be happening in the Olympics or in elections or what have you, which doesn't really pertain to the core use case that we have, or even that he's trying to build with a similar set of technology. But I think that's a good example of, you have to kind of take it kind of a step further. And ultimately, with, you know, anything on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or what have you, you know, it's a marketplace of attention, and you're kind of competing with a lot of other noisy pieces of content that all have entertainment value and have to find kind of a wedge there. So long, short, you know, we'll experiment with some new stuff. We have some kind of early ideas that might start trickling out next week. But to get back to kind of one of the questions you asked, for us, you know, we of course need to figure out distribution, and every startup needs to figure out both innovation and distribution, and needs to figure that out faster than the incumbents can innovate, since they already have a lot of built-in distribution. And one of the things that we're really interested in exploring is what I'll just call kind of multiplayer mode, making these products more conducive to the actual workflows of creators and the people who are using them. So I think what I've seen through a lot of these kind of the early people who've found some success and have launched is, it's a lot of single player product. It's a single individual who's kind of going through the workflows. But in reality, if you talk to, you know, the indie filmmaker who's got to work with somebody to rewrite the script and needs to get approvals from the production company, or you talk to folks within kind of businesses, or even kind of going back to my experience at Shutterstock, you know, to truly kind of do this within any sort of established organization, it is a team sport, and there's sign off, and everybody wants creative control, and there's kind of levels of review. And because I have so much depth of knowledge in like the design space, I look to companies like Figma who were able to make design after it had been a single player experience for 20 or 30 years, a multiplayer experience, and started bringing in new people into the fold. And ultimately, I think when you think about how do you build a successful product, a big component is often how do you create kind of network effects? How do you ensure that the product has increasing levels of value as more and more people use that product? And I think a thing that a lot of folks in AI are experiencing is because of that novelty effect, you can get a lot of people to try a product out, but retention, there's a lot of like VCs who have published good data around this. Retention for these AI products is really low. It's typically a lot lower than non-AI products, some of these more traditional products. And so, figuring out how to get interest is not easy, but that's one part of the equation. Figuring out how to keep people around is another part. And so, going back to the main point, we do think some of these collaborative features that some are already baked into the product, some are upcoming. So I don't want to give too much away. But we think that is kind of one potential avenue to both kind of acquire users and to actually solve real problems of how does this content kind of go from, kind of the early stages of the idea of I need to reach a new audience, I need to reach somebody in a different country or in a different language to actually kind of finding success and going through that entire workflow.
So when you say single player, multiplayer, like, do you mean like teams with seats? And so I'd have a Slator account and I have like a team of 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 people that are collaborating or something like this?
Yeah. So that's it's a hypothesis. That's what we're exploring right now, where you could basically have a team. Anybody could, different levels of permissions, but people could dub content, they could approve content, they could modify scripts. You could have somebody dubbing content from English to French. And if they don't speak French, you might need somebody to actually review that French transcript to ensure that the translation keeps the original meaning intact. And so it could kind of invite somebody in at that point, and then, have this library that everybody can kind of pull from and acts as a source of truth. So I think there's a lot of analogous products in the design space, and we'll see if there's room for that within kind of this world as well.
So you mentioned indie films. So that kind of brings, that to me, that expands the category even more because we have like the podcasters, the YouTubers, like the kind of mid to, maybe mid-sized YouTubers, then the very big YouTubers that might actually have a team, right? And then you go B2B, maybe some corporate content. But indie film, even though it's indie, it's still likely going to be, 10, 20, 30, 40 people that are collaborating on something like this, right? So where would you put, or have you put in the past, your initial focus? Where have you gotten most traction, and maybe which areas? Well, you touched on that already, but like, where would you see the easiest kind of next step, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, for us, a lot of the organic interest has come from YouTubers and podcasters. There's a lot of people with, call it 500,000 subs, 1 million subs, who had mentioned kind of earlier, at least alluded to them, who are starting to think about this. And because the barriers are coming down from a cost perspective and an execution perspective, it's now much more feasible where it wasn't before. Longer term, I think that audience is going to be kind of fully served by kind of the YouTubes of the world. So Google last year opened up a beta, kind of private beta for this tech. They were building it internally, and they have plans to kind of roll that out more broadly. We'll see how that goes. Spotify, same thing. I think it was in mid-October last year. They announced that they had a kind of a really small pilot program with some really large podcasters, like a handful of large podcasters like Lex Friedman, potentially Andrew Huberman, a few others. And they have intention, last I heard, to kind of roll this out. And so a lot of these kind of classic content creators, I think, are going to have their needs met as these features become kind of free in those platforms. And I think that's just, it feels natural and very, very inevitable. If you start kind of moving up the stack, you get into creators who demand higher level of control and a higher level of just quality. Of course, in the most extreme example, if you're building a Marvel film or creating a Marvel film, like, you can't have any degradation around audio or video quality. That goes without saying. And you need, scripts that are kind of watertight in all those other languages. And I think we've seen, given a lot of the writer strikes and the strikes in Hollywood last year, that there's at a certain level within the industry kind of an aversion to AI. And, just generally, there's a lot of fear around AI kind of taking jobs and replacing people. And I think that's understandable. That said, and having talked to, a lot of folks in the industry, the indie filmmakers tend to be much more open because they're operating on smaller budgets, and they need every advantage that they can get. So go back to my buddy Nick. He's creating films somewhere in the $500,000 to $1 million range, so it doesn't have huge budgets. But to your point, he has, in any one project, like 50 to 100 people who are working on it across actors, screenrunners, gaffers, videographers, etc. And there's just a lot of coordination there. In his current film right now, he's actually filming half of it in Mandarin and half of it in English. And so, got to, what somewhat of a niche and unique situation, but got to really kind of understand like what that workflow looked like. And so, I think that audience is kind of interesting to go after. We've also had a lot of inbound interest from companies, and there's kind of been two main use cases. There's been the more external facing use case of I want to run ads and need a way to localize ads. This is very close to a lot of the stuff that I saw at Shutterstock. And then there's also the internal communication component, because increasingly companies are multinational, or they're hiring developers in Brazil or in Ukraine or what have you. And so we've had folks reach out, and when I get them on a call, the use case is, hey, the CEO needs to be able to give his all hands, and the recording needs to be made available to everybody, whether they're in Taiwan or in Italy. And so, that's a very kind of interesting market that we're starting to explore.
So interesting that you're mentioning this. I had a friend call me recently and ask, hey, my CEO staff is asking me to basically translate the CEO's speech into various languages, and I guess, and he's like, sure, can do. Reached out to some other partners, and I think got it done. And then I think one of the complaints was, oh, but it's not lip synced, right? And that's like, it's just a few weeks ago, and I was like, okay, I mean, and that's a Fortune 500 old school kind of company, right? But expectations are so high now that something like this now is perfectly localized, translated, lip synced, everything. So that happened super fast.
A year ago, that wasn't the case. Like, lip sync technology wasn't quite there. And in talking to creators, some people wanted lip sync. There was actually a group of creators who felt like it was less relevant for a few different reasons. But it is interesting just how fast the tech is moving. And as a result of that, how fast expectations are also moving, because expectations are kind of boundless. And, people always are, get settled with what is current and then are ready for kind of the next thing or ready for the next improvement.
Now, what's not moving so fast is YouTube rolling out this kind of additional audio channel thing that you mentioned, and even Spotify. Like, why do you think they're taking so long? Because we wrote about this like 18 months ago, or maybe a year ago, and it's just so slow. I'm not sure if anybody other than like Mr. Beast has it. Maybe a couple more huge creators.
It's just the biggest creators still at this point, despite them signaling that it would be rolled out this year. So it could still come this year, and that initial prediction could still be true. I don't think it's because of the tech. I think the tech is becoming relatively commoditized. I mean, in order to pull this off, you need 5 or 6 kind of models to do everything from speech to text, of course, the translation, kind of generating new speech, and then do things like speech alignment and noise suppression and all that. And of course, a company like Google has best-in-class ML researchers. And so if it's not the tech, and it's obviously not the distribution, they can just kind of bake this in and start using it right away. I have to think that there's legal kind of considerations here. And, I don't have any inside knowledge, but just to kind of theorize what may be happening, if you start allowing people to edit transcripts so that, the intended use case is to ensure that the output transcript, of course, is accurate. And again, it represents the meeting, and there was no kind of words that were initially captured wrong or translated improperly. And of course, there's a lot of nuance to kind of doing that. But you could also imagine kind of abuse around that, where you can, kind of edit transcripts and start getting people to say things that they didn't actually say. And in the early days, a company like YouTube had to break a lot of laws, and more or less had a lot of illegal content on their platform to kind of find success, and they were much less risk adverse. And you have to imagine they're a little bit more kind of cautious and thoughtful and risk adverse as they're rolling out this technology. But like you, eagerly waiting to understand when they roll this out and what that product looks like in its final form.
You mentioned all the components before, but for Supernative, I mean, you mentioned 11 labs for audio and some other technologies. Like, can you just tell us a bit more about your stack? Like, how do you put these things together for Supernative? Where do you kind of double down yourself? Where it's just an API or something else? And then, of course, if given the audience of this podcast, the translation component would be very interesting.
Yeah. So we use a lot of well-known models. So Whisper, again, to just detect speech and translate speech to text. That is kind of an industry-leading model. We've experimented with a few open source models, and the quality just wasn't quite where OpenAI is. So continue to use that. Same thing with the translation. We use ChatGPT. One of the things that we're experimenting with is actually using multiple models there, so we can detect discrepancies and then actually surface those discrepancies to the user. So we can say, hey, OpenAI or Model A, I don't know if people actually care about the tech under the hood, but Model A says that this word in French is X, and this other model is saying that it's Y. And of course, that creates new challenges in terms of how do they resolve that? Can you give them a path to resolving that? But today, ChatGPT and then 11 Labs, as mentioned, is truly the gold standard as it relates to speech generation. There's some open source models out there, like there's open source models now for everything. They haven't quite caught up. It will be interesting to understand in 6 to 18 months' time how good some of these open source models become, because as a quick aside, if these open source models become as good or if not better than some of these private models, then you can imagine cost really, really coming down. And, that's something that we're, of course, paying attention to and are kind of trying new stuff almost on a monthly basis right now. In addition to that, we have kind of models for speaker verification so that we can accurately detect up to 10 speakers. We can actually do more, but that's what we cap it at. So we can understand if it's me speaking or you speaking or somebody else speaking, and properly attribute the generation to that individual. Kind of speech alignment, because of course when you're dubbing something into an output language, that output language, it's not always a one-to-one match in terms of the characters or the length of the speech. And so we try to do our best to kind of align the speech with the original voice, and of course the lip movements. We've experimented with a few different lip syncing models. We use something called Sync Labs out of YC. We found that that's kind of the best. And then have some kind of homegrown stuff around like vocal separation and background noise suppression, so that we can really isolate the speaker's voice and try to deliver the best possible output.
How about timing? I mean, how do you feel about Supernative's particular timing? My view would be it's maybe not, I mean, I'm not sure if it's perfect, but very good in that current cycle, because it's kind of still early enough to have some uniqueness and traction and novelty factor. And, and you can put these models together in a way that maybe nobody else has and get like your initial client cohort. But it's not, it's not too early and it's not too late either. Because if you had tried this maybe 3 years ago, you probably would have been too early, right? And if you tried in a year, I guess it would be somewhat too late. How do you feel about the timing component of starting something like this now?
Yeah. I mean, just as a high level statement, timing is arguably one of the most important variables as it relates to startup success. I've seen plenty of teams have the right idea, the right team, and just get the timing wrong, whether it's technology or the behavior is just not ready. and kind of the culture is not there. So, when I think of kind of timing of the market, I think we can break it down into a few different components. And so with this space, the initial risk was really around the technology. Can we get the product to work, and can we get the product to work well enough? And I think that question needs to be answered in the context of work well enough for whom? Because working well enough for the YouTuber with 500,000 subs is a little bit different than, of course, working well enough for the multi-million-dollar Hollywood production. And so, the technology risk, I think, is still there for the top end of the market, but the technology is working well enough for a lot of folks in the market. And then beyond technology, there's like market risk. Like, can we build something that people actually love? And I think HeyGen, like there was Rask AI that was early. There was a company acquired by Adobe, but HeyGen, I think, was like the first real breakout that proved they could build something that people loved and were willing to go through a subpar product experience, waiting in this really, really long queue because they couldn't scale their technology fast enough because they had so much inbound interest. And so if those two boxes are checked, at least at a high level, then it's about kind of scaling and can you acquire kind of lots of customers? And that's where a lot of these companies are at right now. HeyGen, growing incredibly quickly right now. 11 Labs, kind of same thing. And then if we keep going down the stack, like the next two things I think about is business model and can we serve these customers profitably? Because it's easy to build tech that is not sustainable and it's not profitable. And then eventually you get down to kind of the last thing, which I don't think makes sense to get too deep on, but defensibility. And can you actually maintain market share and build something that's truly differentiated and defensible? And so, from a market perspective, just to oversimplify it, we're kind of in that scaling risk right now. Can you acquire customers? Some companies are showing that they can. And we think there's more interest in this tech than ever. Even if you go to like Google Trends and you search something like dubbing and you look back 5 years, you will see that the amount of interest right now is roughly double what it was about 5 years ago. And so I've seen this again in the design space where you get these new tools, the barriers come down, kind of the technology helps democratize the skill set, and that just explodes the market. And that's, we're kind of in that Cambrian explosion phase. I think the big question here is you have a lot of incumbents, as we've already addressed, who are all interested in this, and they're trying to either bake this into the platform, in the example of YouTube or Spotify, or they're trying to bake it into kind of the video editing software, where there's, or audio editing software, and of course there's a lot of fragmentation there. And so we're thinking about how might we partner with some of those people and kind of offer the tech and do some of that, and a lot of that's early. But it'd always be nice to be, 6 months earlier, but we still think we have something compelling, and, we're still, we're really early. We haven't even officially announced this thing. We're going to kind of, really go live next week. But we're still getting a lot of inbound interest from, even this week, one of the largest governments on earth is reaching out, and we're kind of working on a custom deal for them. So, I think there's, again, just the market is growing and all boats should lift and rise.
You mentioned pricing before. Do you think it's a risk, like once you hit that maybe viral success, or once like you get massive traction, like in terms of the cost size, is that something that you're looking at? Your AWS or Google Cloud bill or whatever other API you tap. I remember the HeyGen story where I think they had to stop it because they had this huge backlog, and I think this it got really expensive for them. Or is that something that factors into your decision making and feature choice at this point?
Yeah, it definitely does, and I think from my perspective and the team's perspective, the real risk there is there's a lot of people still kicking the tires on this technology. And they're just kind of curious about it. And we've seen use cases of people just dubbing their own voice and there's no commercial application. It's just, it's kind of going back to the novelty idea. It's kind of this cool thing that you can now do with tech. And so, the balance that we're trying to strike is how do we give people enough of a taste of the product through things like free minutes and all of that to ensure that they understand kind of the quality of the product, and both from a UI UX perspective as well as the output again, without necessarily racking up kind of too large of a bill. Because from our perspective, we have a pretty good handle on costs, and we'll see if this holds true, but we have a theory on how things are going to scale from a cost perspective as it relates to either some of these paid services or AWS. But the real question is around, can we truly target the right audience and get those folks to convert? Or are we going to get a lot of window shoppers or tire kickers who use the product just to test it out, but have no intention of converting? And of course, every minute of that service kind of cost us. And the last thing I'll say, just to double down on something that I had alluded to earlier, we're pretty bullish on a lot of these models that right now are really just owned by individual companies becoming kind of more open source. And so on the model side, with like lip sync or speech generation, those costs becoming dramatically lowered as we're able to host those own models and just run them for a lot less, because that's not the core business. The core business, of course, is the dubbing.
Do you see Meta as like the driver for the open source for open source generally in AI at the moment?
I think on a macro level, they are the driver. They're doing a lot of interesting things. And of course, Meta has the resources and the talent that few companies have. But there's kind of projects that are kind of cropping up all over the place. And I feel like, even again, going on like what I was mentioning earlier, like on a monthly basis, there's new models and like a new lip sync model. We're like, hey, let's try this out. Let's see if it's good enough. Oh, it's not quite good enough, but let's keep monitoring it. Let's try it out in 3 months and, see if that will kind of be good enough or good enough for a certain tier of maybe lower paying customers where we can make it available at a lower cost, and then, have kind of the private model available for folks who, are paying more and need that level of quality.
What's the current thinking around founders like yourself, like I would call them language AI founders in 2024, around where like a human would still sit in the language loop, right? For you in translation, I think you have a certain editing features in the platform. Where do you see from your customers, your individual customers, like still demand for a human to sit in that loop, production loop?
Yeah. So, I think there's pretty broad acknowledgement at this point that if you're using any LLM to do a translation, it's only going to be 80, 90+% kind of accurate. Said another way, it's not 100% accurate. And even if we get to that world where we're using multiple models to try to improve the accuracy, it's still not going to be 100% accurate. And so if you have what I call kind of internally like higher stakes content creators, if you have someone who has to get it right, you still need that human component to verify that output transcript that, of course, then feeds into the dubbing. And so, we're really interested in exploring that. I think there's another company or two kind of in that space who are trying to more or less marry kind of the SaaS AI software with a little bit of a more what I would call a marketplace, just given my experience. I think, obviously these models are advancing at just an incredible mind-bending rate. But even if we look out a few years, I still think, for kind of the truly professional content creator, where quality matters, where accuracy is the most important kind of decision-making variable, you are going to need humans who are, signing off on things and providing that extra level of kind of security and confidence.
Glad to hear that. And a lot of other people on this podcast will be happy to hear it as well. Translation, could go all philosophical, which we have done many times in the podcast before, but, it's only so much computable. Financing, I guess so far you bootstrapped the company. Do you have any plans to take outside funding? Must be a not the worst environment if you have a product with good traction right now in AI.
Yeah. So we've bootstrapped it, to your point. We'd explored financing a little bit here and there just to better understand kind of the market and how VCs were thinking about it. But it's fully self-funded at this point. And, where we've really kind of come to is that gives us a level of advantage. Like we think we can just run a much more efficient company while still having, A+ kind of talent on the technical side and without kind of all the overhead and honestly some of the expectations that come with VC. I've raised VC in the past. I joined a company very, very early on that was acquired, and then we spun the company out and raised VC. And I say this because anytime you take on money, you then have a different set of expectations, and kind of the expectations for how fast you need to grow and the outcomes you need to achieve become really, really heightened. And of course, we've all kind of heard stories of people who have just over diluted the company, and the growth of the company didn't quite match that dilution. And then you have founders who end up just owning a very, very small percent of that company, sometimes not even really controlling the destiny of the company. And so not to say that we're completely opposed to outside financing, but right now, really just focused on trying to build a great product and trying to, just run this thing in a bootstrap manner.
To finish off, what's on the roadmap, if anything you can share with us? I know it's probably not, you don't want to open up everything, but just anything exciting coming up for the rest of the year, early 2025?
Yeah. I some stuff that's exciting, at least to me. So, I think there's a few pillars here. One of it is just improving the fundamentals. I think a lot of companies, even in this space, are, maybe getting a little distracted and kind of going off and kind of losing sight of that core customer promise, the core reason that they exist. And so, we really want to ensure that like the voice cloning quality kind of gets better. Want to try to expand into more languages, improve things like lip sync, improve things like speech matching, and ultimately just have a product that's kind of getting better on those fundamentals. Beyond that, we have a pretty robust editor that we're really excited about. We allow people to preserve words and lock words from being translated. Obviously, this is quite important, so that if someone's saying Apple computer, that is preserved and it doesn't get translated to the fruit when it's actually getting, kind of pushed to a new language. And so we're really excited about that foundation. And now going back to what I was mentioning earlier, want to start experimenting with some of these collaboration and team features to try to better map to the workflows that we understand a lot of these production companies and businesses kind of already go through. And then kind of further out on the horizon, we think a lot about what are all the necessary ingredients to successful localization. Going back to my Shutterstock experience, learning from some really, really strong people there, it became very clear to me that language, as we all know, and I'm sure as a lot of your listeners know, is just one component. And you have to have like the language, the content, the monetization model. A lot of different things need to go right to be able to actually find success. And I think the tools right now are still quite early. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of people try this, but because this is only like dubbing only solves one piece of the puzzle, they can't quite get all the way there and then they abandon it. But eventually, if we keep drawing the line out, I think the whole process becomes easier. And I think things like localizing a script, or at least providing suggestions on how to cater the script, whether it's names or kind of, being aware of political sensitivities, is all stuff that we're kind of interested in exploring. And then at some point, the tools aren't quite there yet, but actually localizing kind of the video content itself is, would be amazing. The way that I think about it and we talk about it is Pixar level kind of localization, where if you look at a Pixar film, everything from the names of the characters to the dishes that they're eating, to the sports that they're playing, to the animals, whether it's a panda bear in China or a black bear in the United States, all of that stuff is changing. And of course, we already see a lot of stuff happening in the image space, some stuff starting to happen in the video space, and eventually we think we can get to a point where we can isolate frames, isolate objects within the frames, and basically like repaint them. And so, that's a little bit further out. That stuff is, much more kind of experimental, but, really what we're trying to do is just like highly focus on localization and not try to chase real-time translation or real-time dubbing, I should say, and not try to chase, some other features, and just try to build the best product in this space.
Very, very interesting and great stretch target there with the localization of everything inside inside the visual as well. Paul, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yes, thank you for having me.